Truth is a core principle at Machon Shilo, which is headed by Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. And that is why it is such an honor to have with us Jewish hero Jonathan Pollard, who is one of the voices of truth of this generation. Thank you again, Jonathan, for your having sat in prison for 30 years and for your having endured torture at the hands of the American government and having refused to rat on fellow Jews. Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom, my friend Jonathan Pollard, and to our viewers. So let's get right down to it. It is clear that the Jewish nation is in dire need of a radically different ideology, an ideology based on the Torah. However, having said that, we do not exist in a vacuum. Israel, as we all know, is at war. We are all aware that Israel is heavily dependent on the US for various weapons systems and ordnance. To me, it is obvious that Israel must become essentially self-sufficient regarding its weaponry and military supplies. How, in your view, can Israel successfully prosecute this war at this point in time while still relying heavily on the US for armaments?
First of all, I think we have to realize one very important thing, and that is the fact that Israel is at least the fourth, possibly the fifth largest nuclear power in the world. And while we may not want to acknowledge that or confirm that in public, we should at least act that way. And what that means for the Americans, I'll give you a very good example. We were supposed to get a certain piece of military hardware from the Americans as per our understandings before this war started. We didn't when the war started because the Americans considered it escalatory. My response to that was to advise certain people, well and good, tell the Americans, if you don't want to keep your word, that's fine. We'll just use a nuclear munition instead. Would you like that? And you have 24 hours to deliver the promised equipment, or that's what's going to happen. The reaction from the people I told that was the equivalent of gasp and vapors. They were clutching their pearls, so to speak. The bottom line on this whole thing is it isn't really what you have, it's how you act with what you have. It's been a cardinal principle that Israel should be, to a large extent, self-reliant in terms of basic military hardware and even some of the more sophisticated stuff. But it hasn't happened, in fact. And that's because it's just very easy to be on the dole. If I can use an analogy for that, back when Lyndon Johnson was the president of the United States, he started a welfare program called the Great Society. And it handed out a welfare, mostly to the people of color, the underprivileged people of color. And they were shocked that after a generation, none of these people wanted to work. It's quite obvious why. When you just give somebody something, they'll keep taking it. And that's basically what's happened with our military supplies. The issue here for us is if we had to pay for our own military equipment, augmented by export sales, of course, but if we had to, out of our own budget, we would have far fewer enemies than we have right now. Why? Because the electorate would demand that they get value for their money. If we have a problem on the border and we're paying a heavy price for our military establishment to either contain or destroy this problem, then get on with it. And so the military would have to change its mindset from a more defensive mindset, which is in tune with what our American patrons would rather have us adopt. They'd have to change that to a more offensive doctrine, where the weapons would be used, the enemy would be destroyed, and we could stand down a bit, particularly in terms of our defense burden on the electorate.
I just want to interrupt you for one moment and point out that it's not as if we receive anything at all for free from
Correct.
anybody, certainly not from the United States.
Correct.
Even the military aid that Israel receives from the United States is, to the best of my understanding, 1.5% of the military budget. That's it.
Correct.
1.5% is a very small, relatively speaking, a very small amount. But in
Quite
fact,
right.
what it is a subsidy for the U.S. defense industry.
There you go. There you go. It is. And unfortunately, there's a revolving door here between the Kirya, the military high command, and the consultantships that the American military industrial complex has here. So you'll have retired generals basically advocating for more dependency on American military systems so that, I mean, let's be honest about this, so they can get more commissions. That's the bottom line. It's been a principle of American military aid to Israel that aid serve a double purpose, or actually a triple purpose. One, you just alluded to, it's a subsidy for the American military industrial complex, because an ever greater amount of that aid has to be spent over there. Second of all, it has the knock-on effect of destroying our own military industrial complex. And the most egregious example of this are in military boots. We used to be a tremendous manufacturer of army boots. They were some of the best in the world. No more, because we had to spend the money on American boots that were and are far inferior. The third aspect of being on the dole is control. And to the extent that the Americans control spare parts and training and certain codes to operate certain systems, they have us. So our flexibility is constrained. Our ability to act independently on our national security interests as we define them is severely constrained. I hear it all the time when I talk to groups, military officers, or when I go into the Kirya or whatever. We can't do this, we can't do that, because they could choke our supplies off. Okay?
All right, so here we have two questions, therefore. The question that I asked was how, at this point in time, given the current situation, which is, as you've described it, and which is disastrous, how can we prosecute this war at this moment in time?
Okay.
Despite that reality. And the other question, of course, is how can we eventually, hopefully in the not too distant future, bring about some serious changes in this area?
All right. 3 years ago when I came home, I indicated that there were four weapon systems we had to develop quickly in order to make short shrift of any campaign that we were forced to undertake in Gaza. We still have time to manufacture those weapons. I don't want to get into the details of them, but suffice to say, they are easy enough for us on our own quickly to manufacture. Number two, from a strategic standpoint, there are two axes that we have to occupy. One is the axis between Khan Yunis and Rafah or Rafiah. We literally have to drive a column through those two cities to the coast and start digging a trench all the way along that line, basically to cut off and destroy the tunnels that are going between Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafiah. So those tunnels are cut. We also have to reoccupy the Philadelphia corridor, which is the line along the border with Egypt. So there are two immediate axes of advance that we have to occupy and dig trenches, basically, to interdict all the tunnel systems. This will basically isolate the entire battlefield, the theater, if you will, of Gaza. We can do this rather quickly. So the use of certain weapons that we can create ourselves quickly, within, I would say, 3 weeks. The isolation of Khan Yunis and Rafiah from each other and from Egypt. And then we have to pull the Chayalim, the soldiers, out of Gaza City. And we have to use those weapons that I have been advocating we build to completely turn Gaza City into rubble. Now, one of those systems will completely destroy all electrical systems in the Strip, all of them. And apart from preventing Hamas from launching any more rockets, none, or being able to communicate, even with a landline, what they will also do, and this is critical, they will destroy the ventilation system in the tunnels. We have avoided doing that for who knows what reason. We're allowing all this fuel now in. Well, what is that? What is Hamas using the fuel for?
I'm sorry to interrupt. We know what the fuel is being used for. First and foremost, for the ventilation systems.
Correct.
Second of all, for the electricity. But surely this all goes back to our original question, which was, given that we are so dependent at this point in time, unfortunately, on American weapon systems and ordnance, and they threaten us without a doubt constantly regarding these matters. How can we go ahead and do these things knowing that they can just cut off our supplies?
Okay, they can try that. They can threaten that. But we have what I would call the ultimate ace in the hole. And it's what I alluded to, but what I stated before. We are the fourth or maybe the fifth largest nuclear power. And we should start acting that way. And that's simply put, if the Americans want to turn Lebanon or Iran or even the Strip into a nuclear slag heap, that's on them. They want to cut us off. The issue of cutting off weapon systems has, unfortunately for the Americans, has a very scary effect on other countries that are thinking about buying American weapon systems and about how reliable they might be in a situation that's not to America's liking. The Saudis have to think about this. The Gulf states in general have to think about this. Even Ukraine has to think about it. Taiwan has to think about this. All of these countries, to a greater or lesser extent, yes, even Ukraine, are involved with diversification of military equipment. Why? Why would countries want to diversify their military equipment? It's because they want to reduce the risk of blackmail. That's why. Many of these countries don't have the ability that we have to actually produce most of the military equipment that they need. Without getting into details about what we can and we can't produce, the main thing to remember is, even if the United States cut off everything right now, we have the ability through, for example, 3D manufacturing, additive manufacturing, to make most of the spare parts that we need. And if push came to shove, as I gave a brief once on this, we need 20 minutes to eliminate Iran as a threat, both to us and the region. 20 minutes, that's all. And then what? What are they going to do? Pass a condemnation of us in the United Nations? Please don't threaten me with a good time, if that's what they want to do. God gave us the ability right now to destroy our enemies, independent of the United States or any other world power. Let me give you an example of something. My father, alav shalom, once asked me, what was it that kept the peace during the Cold War between the great powers, the superpowers? And I went through a whole host of things I'd learned in war colleges. And he said, no. He said it was the fact that we dropped not only one, but two bombs. The first bomb was for Japan. The second bomb was basically as a demonstration to the Russians that we have this system and we're willing to use it. Nobody, Ralph, wants to talk about the bomb. Nobody. And I've asked people in positions of authority, why did we build the bomb? Why did we spend so much treasure on Dimona? Why? And the answer was, well, for deterrence. Look around you now. Are they acting deterred? And I told them at that point, well, here's a news flash. Our enemies are not deterred anymore. They're not scared of us. So we have to act with these weapons in a responsible way, if that isn't inconsistent, in a responsible way that will not only reestablish our credibility, but also will eliminate our enemies in the briefest period of time possible. The Americans, yes.
Would you say it's accurate to say that the need for us to take out the big guns has become necessary, but would not have been necessary had we done what we needed to do vis-a-vis the Hezbollah in Iran 10 or 15 years ago?
Correct. We adopted this kick the can down the road, managing the threat, mowing the grass, whatever euphemism you wanted to use or metaphor you wanted to use for that. We relied upon a defensive mindset that put off the need to eliminate an enemy at the earliest possible time. And now we can't touch Hezbollah because of the size of the precision arsenal it has. This is not a technical issue. Look, there was a point in time a few weeks ago when we could have devastated Iran's heavy missile armory in Lebanon. Could have done it. What did we do? We asked the Americans. And the Americans, not surprisingly, said, no, don't.
Are you stating
we don't want this
Are you stating that as a fact that you know?
Yeah, as a fact. As a fact. We were in a position several weeks ago to strike first.
No, I understand. I'm asking whether you know for a fact that Israel asked permission of the
yes,
US.
no. On that one, I'm dead certain, because I actually talked to the person who was tasked with asking the Americans, and he was devastated that he had that responsibility. People don't understand the degree of danger we're in right now. And it isn't from Hamas rockets or cross-border terror raids, or it isn't from the massive military arsenal that we allowed the Iranians to build in Lebanon, or even the incipient Iranian nuclear ordnance plan with their associated delivery systems. That isn't what scares me. What scares me is the mental fear, the spiritual fear that our betters in the government and in the military suffer from. And I could say they have no yirat shamayim, but that would be begging the question as to whether they even have a concept of God, which they don't. They just don't.
For the benefit For the benefit of some of our viewers, we should perhaps point out that Yirat Shamayim in Hebrew means fear of heaven.
Right. So what happens in a case like this is you're almost infantilized, where before you do anything, you have to ask father and mother, Abba and Nemo, can I go to the bathroom now? And that's basically the position we've placed ourselves in. It doesn't matter whether we're militarily self-sufficient. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, Rav, that we have no imported armaments at all. None, zero. We've produced everything ourselves. We control the entire supply chain for all the weapons we have. Wouldn't do us any good, because the people we elect and the military personnel who are currently serving in the general staff are afraid to use it without permission from, I like to joke about the Puritz, the Tsar. They have a colonial mentality right now. And it's been working slowly. If we had the generals back in 1967 that we have now, all those graves that were being done in Tel Aviv and in Yerushalayim and other places.
I think you meant to say the other way around. If we had today the generals that we had in 1967.
Oh, no. I meant it the other way. That if we had the generals that we have today back in 1967.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
Right? Those kevers, thousands and thousands, that were expecting 20,000 dead, they would have been filled. And heaven knows what the outcome of that war would have been. However, if we had the generals today that we had back in 1967, things would have been completely different. I'm quite certain. But just as we had a problem with the Bagatz, the High Court, where they self-selected and self-promoted and developed their own philosophy, independent of everyone except themselves, the same thing happened in the military. That's why for 3 years, I haven't been calling for judicial reform, as needed as that is. I've been calling for military reform, because even if we weren't self-sufficient, we would have the willingness and the predisposition to use what we had effectively against our enemies. You never, ever, it's a cardinal principle of military philosophy. You never yield the initiative to the enemy, ever. You never let the enemy shape the battlefield, ever. Well, that's what's happened over the course of 50, 60 years. We have allowed the enemy to have the initiative, not only the strategic initiative, but as we just saw on October 7th, the tactical initiative as well.
Yonatan?
Yes.
Were you saying before that we had the opportunity to use armaments to remove their heavy armaments and then we didn't do it? Does that imply that had we done it, we would not have had to use the really, really big guns we have?
Correct. Look, when I brief these 4 weapon systems, the first thing somebody does is put their hand up and say, well, we don't want to talk about nuclear weapons. And I immediately have to say, I'm not talking about nuclear weapons. I'm talking about conventional weapons that we should have built years ago to handle just this situation in Oslo. Because of what was called the Revolution in Military Affairs, this acronym is RMA, which basically had to do with increased precision in the delivery of munitions, we could kind of get around not using nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. Well, now there's an adage that sometimes quantity is a quality in and of itself. We are being overwhelmed. Our sophisticated air defense systems and land defense systems are literally being overwhelmed by this plethora of weapon systems in Lebanon and in Gaza. So What do we do about that? I've had an argument, a really bad argument with people over, and I'm using this as an example, Yemen with the Houthis. And the minute I got up to speak, somebody said, yeah, we know. You believe we should just nuke them, right? What are you going to tell us? And I said, no. Where did you get that? I'm going to suggest that we use what we have in a different way to take that particular front off the map. And we can do it in 2 strikes, one after the other. And then, if you want to use a nuclear weapon, then we can have a discussion. So they just, and this is an example. I said it would take just a few weeks to create these, to manufacture the weapon systems and install them that we need to eliminate the Houthi threat completely. And nobody listened. They didn't want to hear it. They would rather conduct these air defenses, which just today, a few minutes ago, in fact, shot down an inbound cruise missile to Eilat. We're playing a numbers game. I'm telling you right now, one of those cruise missiles is gonna hit something big in Eilat, like a hotel, jam-packed with evacuees. And we're going to have a butcher's bill.
They hit a school.
And everybody's going to say, well, what can we do? Oi, what can we do? Beg the Americans? They aren't going to get involved. Beg the UN? That's for sure they're not going to get involved. We have to take care of this ourselves. So you have to think, what do we have that we can repackage to eliminate this problem? Nobody's thinking that way in the high command. I don't know how they selected people to deal with scenarios like this.
I do know.
Just look at me with a blank face.
I think I do, in fact, know how they selected these people. They cloned over the last, you said 50, 60 years, which is also accurate, but certainly since the disaster known as Oslo.
Correct.
They have cloned a very, very incompetent but very obedient type of military officer who believes in this in this Oslo religion, basically.
And it is a religion.
It is because it defies all logic and reason, and no fact is allowed to be marshaled against this religious precept and concept. Right. So they choose people who will, without exception, people who will
embrace the faith,
fit that mold and that narrative.
Correct.
But you mentioned the UN. I wanted to ask another question, which somehow is connected to the UN in some way. In your view, how should Israel regard and deal with those who are constantly berating Israel, about abiding by international law?
Okay.
Just 1 second, do you think that accommodating such demands will strengthen or weaken Israel, or perhaps even endanger its very existence?
The latter. First of all, I refer to the UN as a Knesset of hate. We have no business being in that organization whatsoever. We're there simply as a punching bag. Second of all, as far as international law is concerned, I accept only one law, and that's the law given to us in the Torah. That's it. I will not accept any other man-made law as being determinative as far as what we can and cannot do. Everything we need to defend ourselves, everything we need to live a good, healthy life in this jungle of an environment that we've been placed in can be found in the Torah.
You
So
you won't receive any argument from me on that score, but there are many people who would say to you, you're not being realistic. We live in the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. And if we do not abide by international law, there will be sanctions, and there will be all kinds of ramifications. And in fact, some people claim, and I've heard this recently with my own ears and eyes, it was sent to me by somebody, that the claim that by abiding by international law, we will strengthen Israel's international standing and strengthen the state of Israel and guarantee its ongoing existence. That's more or less what was said to me by someone very recently. What would you say to such a person?
I would say to them that what they're advising us to do, or suggesting that we do, is play a loaded game. It's stacked against us. There's no way in the world that we could justify our existence under the current interpretation of international law.
And the word interpretation, I think, is central to our discussion, because it's all about interpretation.
Correct.
One can, and there have been such documents and books written with regards, for example, with regards to the status of Yudan Shomron, also known by some as the West Bank, for example, or the Golan Heights, or what have you. There are those who say it's occupied territory, as we know. That's the standard narrative,
disputed territories.
Disputed territories, what have you. And there's also a school of thought in international law, people who are really real experts in the field. One such person, I think his name was Howard Greif, or Grief. Howard Grief.
I think it's Grief.
I actually met him on one occasion, at least many, many years ago. And he wrote an entire book on the subject. I can't remember the name of the book. Perhaps you can remind us, in which he demonstrated that according to international law, Yudan Shomron, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, whatever a person wishes to refer to these territories, belong to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel, and are not disputed or occupied territories at all.
Rabbi, you know very well that under the concept of the Balfour Declaration, under the terms of the mandate, and under the terms of San Remo, that's our territory. But as you said, the law can be interpreted any way you want it to. You can forget about the fact that there was a San Remo. Okay, hardly anybody remembers that, but what they came up with is determinative. It is a controlling document, which the UN just has completely forgotten. There was the agreement, for example, the tripartite agreement, guaranteeing our right of free passage through the Straits of Tiran, that was given to us kind of as a guarantee if we evacuated Sinai in 1956. And what happened? Abba Eban went to the United States after it was closed by Nasser, the Straits of Tiran, and said, okay, we're invoking the tripartite agreement. You, the French and the Americans and the British, have to open up the straits to us. And do you know what the response of the Americans was? We can't find it. I can't make this up. The State Department literally said to Abba Eban, we can't find the document. So, I mean, it gets to that absurd level. We cannot play this game by their rules. It's stacked against us from the start. Forget about the fact that, personally, I don't recognize any other law than Torah law, period. So if I were going to advocate abiding by international law, I would have to kind of acknowledge to myself that it doesn't work. There is nothing we can do that would give us a fair break in the international court of either opinion or law. So when somebody says we would be in a better position if we abided by international law. My response would be, whose international law? Because you can show me all the laws on the books you want. God knows I've seen enough of them. It's the implementation, it's the interpretation of that law that's determinative, that will determine our position within that system. And it's not going to work well for us. So rather than worry about humanitarian law and guaranteeing corridors for whatever, fuel, water, food, where is this in international law? They just made it up for us. For the Americans, when they killed over 500,000 Iraqi civilians in 2 campaigns, I never heard anything.
Some say 1 million.
So, exactly. I never heard anything about humanitarian aid corridors. Nothing. But for us, there is always going to be a constraining law that will suddenly be either invoked or created to tie our hands. This is why.
So so here I must interrupt you. How does Israel break out of this stranglehold, this impossible set of laws that they make up as they go, and always to our disadvantage? How can Israel wriggle its way out of this predicament?
You can't wiggle it out. You have to take a sledgehammer to it and say one thing. Nobody gave us our land, Eretz HaKodesh, except God, Hashem. We're not beholden to any man-made law or power for our right to the land, number one. Number two, we will follow the Torah in terms of interpreting what our God-given land is. And nobody is going to tell us exactly how to interpret Torah in that regard. As far as our relationship to the world, the one thing the world accepts, they may not respect, but they are going to have to accept, is strength. I believe it was Lenin that once said, you probe with the bayonet until you hit steel, and then you stop. We've never been in that position. We've always been very pliant. We've always been very weak and accommodating. They've never really seen us say no. They've never really seen us push back in a determined way. And we can do that. And the world, as I said, may not respect it, but they will have to accept it, because nobody right now is willing to pay the price, could be willing to pay the price for pushing us back. I have to keep going back, Rabbi, to the central fact. We are a world nuclear power. And I would draw your attention to Kim Jong-il in North Korea. Reviled, condemned, what have you. Ridiculed, but people are scared to death of him. And he's very rational, by the way. Much more rational than the Iranians, trust me. He's interested in maintaining the survival of his family, unlike the Iranians that are waiting for the 13th Imam to come from a catastrophe. I'm advocating a policy not just of indifference towards the world, but of aggression. In the sense that if you poke us, we will cut your head off. If you try to muscle us around, we will hurt you in ways that you can't even begin to imagine. We are a nation that dwells apart. Leave us alone, and we will leave you alone. You try to muscle us about, you try to humiliate us, you try to demean us, you make up lies about our army, you make up lies about our society, fine, go ahead. You can do that, but there will be consequences that you can only dimly imagine right now. I hate taking a quote and operationalizing it as something I can live by. But the Emperor Tiberius had a great philosophy. Let them hate so long as they fear. I only am concerned about my fellow Jews and my relationship to Hashem. That's all. All this other stuff about tikkun olam and improving, this is all claptrap from the liberals. And we see where that's gone. When you come down to
we see the world that they have created.
Correct.
The degenerate Western world that they have created.
It's horrible.
Based on their so-called tikkun olam, they're rectifying and straightening out and improving
the world.
Right.
Please. So when you boil this all down to how we can survive in a world defined by laws that are injurious to our survival, you just have to back away and say, we're not going to follow these.
We're not going to play that game,
that loaded game
that you wish to impose on us.
Correct.
By your rules, because
Correct.
You make up the rules as you go, and they're
Exactly.
always to our disadvantage, and we are not stupid, and therefore we refuse
Correct.
to play that game. Now,
Correct.
The fact is, we have living examples of this around the world. You mentioned North Korea, but you can also speak about a more powerful country, Iran. You could also
China,
Russia. You could also even mention a country which is not China, not Russia, and not even Iran. Turkey. Turkey does exactly as it wishes.
Correct.
It's not a superpower. It does exactly as it wishes. It's not a small country. That's true. It has a large population, I think 87 million or something, I think, approximately. But it's not a power that one cannot deal with. And nevertheless, it does exactly as it pleases. It says what it wants. Their president, who is a devout member of the Muslim Brotherhood,
Erdogan
says what he wishes to say when he wishes to say it.
And how he wishes.
He snubs his nose at the Americans as frequently as he chooses, and he gets away with it. And why is that? Because all these nations that we mentioned have made it clear to everybody else that we are not part of your system. We're not part of the West. We don't believe in your Western values and your ideas. We don't believe in your multicolored flags. And, the new joke is that it's, LGBTQH. What's the H? H is Hamas, right? Because, if when you shout from the river to the sea, etc., then you have to be holding that flag. Otherwise, you're not performing this piece of activism properly according to the textbook. So the difference is that these people are willing to say to these other nations, these other Europe, the United States, The Hague, you name it, we don't believe in your system. We have a different system. We have a different civilization, a different culture. We have different values. In fact, we despise your values and your system. We don't think it's worth very much. We don't, and we certainly won't play that game by your rules.
You can see this.
Israel,
you can see this with the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China.
Right.
South Africa, when they got together, it was based on exactly what you said. We're not going to accept your culture, your rules, your constraints. We're going to start our own system where we don't have to worry about you. And as far as Israel is concerned, we don't need anybody else. We have HaKodesh Baruch Hu. We don't need anybody else. We follow our own laws, our own customs, our own philosophies. We just have to act on them.
Is our own BRICS type access a possibility?
Yes, but it depends on a couple of things. Number one, an independent military, armaments-wise, a new general staff that is unconstrained by the need to follow some woke, liberal attitude towards aggression.
And unconstrained by the High Court, which
And
thinks
unconstrained by either the High
which thinks
Court,
it should be able to make decisions on the tactical level
tactical
on the
decisions.
battlefield.
Correct. One of the reasons, and I digress for 1 second, I have Saudi friends who told me that the reason we're having problems with the Israelis, your people, is that we don't trust you to actually act even in your own self-interest. We don't trust your military is capable of defending your own national interests. And you know what? I couldn't argue with them. I couldn't argue. So how do you define this? If we had a military that was more or less self-sufficient and that was an export power as well, if we were an export power, if we acted in concert with other countries to co-produce for our research and development and co-produce military systems, if we diversified our strategic interests, that's a key concept. Martin, my friend Martin Sherman, has developed this whole concept of strategic diversification, which is brilliant. We need to do that. If we had a political establishment that understood that their only constituency, their only national interest is the land and people of Israel and Yirat Shamayim, fear of heaven, and to act as the ingathering point for the Jews in Galut, then yes, we would have our own bricks. There are many countries that would deal with us. And it changes, the constellation changes all the time. Believe it or not, countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like the UAE, countries like Bahrain, countries like India, countries even in Latin, now Argentina, with a new president.
But India is part of the BRICS axis now.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. We pick and choose who we need. It doesn't matter. We have to be independent of this colonial mentality that we are somehow, we're not even the 51st state. We're not even a territory. Or a commonwealth. The American
or a dependency.
Edom treats us like garbage. We're on the same level as an Indian reservation as far as the Americans are concerned. They were asked, one of their National Security Council representatives was asked, is Israel abiding by international law? Guess what? He didn't answer. But he did. By not answering, he answered. We are insulted right and left by the Americans. They ram this horrible guy, Jack Lew, down our throats as the ambassador. He never should have been accredited here. We should have told them long before he was passed by the Senate, he is inappropriate. This is a pro-Iranian guy. He wants the United States to sign an agreement with the Iranians, another agreement. So part of it is acknowledging our need to change our perception of ourselves in the world so that we can regain our sense of independence and national pride. And part of it is basically using that independence to diversify our strategic alliances. They become much more transactional. Nothing is permanent except a country's interests. We seem to think that countries have permanent friendships. They don't. They have permanent interests, which is why we have to make ourselves the indispensable power in the Middle East. And the only way we can do that in the region is by saying the only power we fear is Hashem, Yirat Shamayim, and we have the weapons and the willingness to act on that. And if we do that, we'll be better off than we are right now.
Let me change tack for this next question. What is your opinion, Jonathan, of the recently brokered so-called hostage deal between Israel and Hamas? Do you consider it to be a mistake? Do you consider it to have been unavoidable or a disaster, perhaps? And if it is a mistake, what would you have done?
This was not a mistake. It was a monstrous blunder. And I'm going to say something that I know is very controversial right now, but I must say it nonetheless. If I had a son or daughter in the army right now in Gaza, I would want them home. Leave. Put your gun down and come home. Why? The casualties that we are incurring right now are pointless. The future is quite discernible. We will not be allowed to destroy Hamas. As I wrote in several pieces, published pieces, Hamas's game plan, and the game plan of the Americans and the Europeans, is to drag out the hostage exchange process to such an extent that they wear us down. They will have the opportunity to reorganize, rearm, reequip, reposition. And worst of all, I said several weeks ago that the Americans in particular and the Europeans will use the quiet to move in humanitarian aid representatives, which will prevent us from doing any military activity for fear of hitting a French doctor or an American aid worker. And now, today, I have proof of that, where the French now have said they're going to move a hospital, a field hospital, into Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis? Yeah. How are we supposed to maneuver around that? Well, we aren't. That's the whole point. I will never, and I know it's dangerous to say never, but I will never vote for the religious Zionist party, ever. Ever. And I have friends, good friends, like Orot Struk and even Bezalel Smotrich and Simcha Rothman. Their decision, I don't care. I've heard Orot Struk's bizarre justification, rationalization for what they did. It's poppycock. I don't know what she's smoked or drunk or what she's been told, but it rings hollow.
She was told.
They caved.
She was told all sorts of things, as was Smotrich and others. Most of those things, if not all of those things, were lies.
Complete.
Just as, for example, what we were told just a few days ago by Netanyahu, and only a fool would believe Netanyahu. We were told a few days ago that we allow fuel into Gaza because to prevent an outbreak of some kind of disease or plague or what have you. Well, pull the other one. And it was necessary to have 60,000 liters of fuel per day to run the sanitation system. So there won't be an outbreak of, I don't know, cholera or some other disease. And now all of a sudden it's 150,000 liters. So wait a second, if it was just 60,000 for that system, why now 150,000? Obviously, right. It was obviously a lie, but right. Many people still find it difficult to believe that Netanyahu is a liar, that all of our leaders and military leaders and political leaders, most of them certainly are liars,
which they are,
and incompetent, and
which
many
they
people
are.
Refuse to believe that. Now, someone like Orit Strok, who is no doubt very well intentioned, but gullible and unaware of the way the world really works, she can be told all manner of she was all sorts of stories, and she bought it, and that's the explanation. She's not. She's to blame because she's out of her depth, but she's not to blame because she doesn't want to do the right thing. She does, but she doesn't know how.
Look, the only party that came out of this mess intact with its honor was Otzma Yehudi. They were the only ones. I cannot at this point vote for any other party except that one. They all have dirt. Look, here's the point. When we declared war, they declared war a long time ago. We just caught up with them. When we declared war, the first thing that the government should have done was declare a state of national emergency and told all of the hostage families, you will keep your mouths shut, or we will shut them for you. You will not interfere in our management of this war. You will not be used by the international community or by our own leftists who managed the Shalit deal as a weapon against us. And if that means imprisoning to silence certain members of the hostage families, then so be it. We're in a state of war. I was dead set against turning all these posters out were kidnapped with all these pictures of these poor people that were kidnapped. Why? Because each one of them was a poison dart at our ability to wage total war against our enemies. We all knew from the start when Tony Blinken, after berating the so-called war cabinet for 7 hours, went and had a meeting with the Kaplan Force people and brothers in arms, telling them, we need you to take over the assistance for the evacuees, and we need you to take control of the hostage issue in order to help us end the war. The argument being, and I wrote about this in the Jerusalem Post, called A Ship of Fools. That was the article. And everything I wrote in there was based on what I was told by people who were eye and ear witnesses to what Tony Blinken did and said. The anti-judicial reform movement has maneuvered itself, allowed itself to be maneuvered by the Americans into a position where they're waiting for the day after, when the guns fall silent, and they will make their move then politically. Look, we saved all the evacuees. We helped them. Look, we spearheaded the hostage, the return of the hostages. I'm not a cruel person by nature. I'm a realist. I once explained to people who were shocked initially by what I said about the hostages by using an analogy that I was taught, if you're the commander of a submarine and that part of that submarine is damaged, the commander, in order to save his ship, his boat, and save the remaining crew members, has to seal off the damaged part. And in the process, unfortunately, condemning all the men that are in that section to death for the greater good. These are decisions that we elect people to make. We do not elect people to use the unfortunate circumstances of the hostages, for example, as an excuse to buckle to the demands of our so-called superpower allies and world opinion. Because what will happen is that at the end, no matter how long this process is going to take, the minute the hostage issue is resolved, the war is over, because the Americans are ready to say, you have no justification for keeping this war going. This is a war of aggression. You got your revenge, you got your people back. That's it. The guns fall silent, or else. This is why you don't go down that road. Why is it that people, everyone I talked to today, was not only ill at ease, but angry over what happened? with this capitulation, and that's what it was, a capitulation by our government to Hamas. They won. They won the war because it doesn't matter. Did you see the list of people that are going to be released? It's horrific. These are people that tried to murder us. And these people are being released. The euphemism is women and children. Excuse me? An 18 or 17-year-old that tried to kill somebody because his knife broke off in the guy's neck and he couldn't stab anymore? This is a child? No, this is a terrorist. So my feeling today is one of intense sadness and anger. We are losing the cream of our people, the Chayalim, our warriors in Gaza right now. More died today. For what? Nothing. Nothing. We've lost the war. And I don't care what Bibi, the liar, says. But when you have someone like Gantz, who bragged about his willingness to sacrifice his men to save innocent Palestinian, quote, civilians, or Gadi Eisenkot, who during the fire balloon campaign against the Negev said that it was against his ethics to attack the teams preparing these balloons because they weren't, really offensive weapons anyway. This is who we're dealing with. And when you have a brain-dead incompetent like Yoav Gallant that doesn't have the brains, as we say in Texas, God gave a pissant, and a dead man, political dead man walking in the form of Bibi Netanyahu, because that's what he is. He's a dead man walking. When you have these people who were directly responsible for October 7th, now in control of things, it's not going to work. You can't have the same people who are responsible for the debacle somehow now saying, okay, we can take care of the problem that, okay, we created. And Bibi hasn't even admitted that yet, by the way. Chas v'shalom. He's not responsible for anything.
Unfortunately, I should point out, it was unfortunately not only predictable, but inexorable that Netanyahu would go along with such a capitulation, with such a hostage deal. If he initiated the Gilad Shalit deal, that was 12, 13 years ago, something like that. He initiated that deal when there was much less pressure and no real need to do so
at all,
for reasons of populism.
Correct.
and gaining favor in certain quarters. It was clear that he would do the same thing in the present situation with much more pressure brought to bear. But it should also be pointed out that according to the Torah, which you mentioned before is the only law that we recognize, correct. According to the Torah, according to the Halakha, according to Jewish law, no such so-called hostage deal could possibly be agreed to. It is against the stipulations of the Halakha. The Halakha states explicitly, and for the very obvious reasons, that in ancient times, some people don't know, so I'll just paint the picture. I'll give the background. If you turn the clock back, shall we say, 2,000 years ago, or 1,800 years ago, or 1,500 years ago, in many parts of the world, certainly in the Mediterranean, you had a kidnapping and hostage industry. You had pirates, correct. You had people who went around grabbing the people. Ships. Yeah, the Bedouins, of course. So that's one. I mean, that's one of their specialties. You had hostages, you had pirates who would grab hostages, and then demand ransom for them. And this was a business. It was an industry, and so much so that there was a market value. In other words, a hostage, a man of this age, had a certain market value. Whatever, let's say it was 50 pieces of silver. So that's what you could demand for such a hostage. And for another kind of hostage, a woman, a different age, whatever it was, another price, because there was a market for this.
Right.
our Chachamim, Chachmei Mishnah and Talmud, the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, stipulated in Masechet Gitin, in the tractate Gitin, that yes, Pidyon Shivuim, the redemption of hostages, of captives, is a great mitzvah, is a very important precept in the Torah, but only,
however,
at the market value, no, not above. Because if you pay beyond the market value, this has nothing to do with war, by the way. This is just a business.
right.
If there's a Jew that you know has been taken captive, yes, we will do everything we can, but not everything. We will go as far as we are able to go, according to the Torah, according to common sense, to redeem this person, and we will pay the market price. But if we agree to pay more than the market price, if the Jews make it known that whatever you demand we'll pay because there's a mitzvah of pidyon shivuim, of redeeming Jewish captives, then this will only encourage these pirates or these Bedouin, whoever they are, to take more Jewish hostages, and that will be self-defeating, and therefore you're not allowed to do so. This of course, just one more sentence for the record. This, of course, has nothing to do with the situation where you are dealing with an enemy who is trying to destroy you, because that was just a business deal. We're pirates. Yes. We have a captive. We want so much silver for him. Will you pay? Yes or no? Here we're talking about allowing our enemy to feel and to be convinced, correctly so, they are gaining a great victory over us. They are able to blackmail us. They are able to prevent us prosecuting the war against them well and
stakes are far higher
and achieving our aims. It goes without saying that such a deal is entirely against the Torah, against the halacha. And yet, how many Torah sages today, how many rabbis did you hear speak against this atrocious and dastardly decision?
Two things, if I may. Towards the end of my operation, I was going to be moved to Europe. And I was to have a new code name. My first code name was Danny Cohen. And this time I was asked, what code name do you want? And I said, I want the name David Ziklag.
You'll have to explain that, I think.
When David, before he was king.
You're talking about King David.
King David had his family, his entire camp, women and children, raided and abducted. He didn't negotiate for their release. He didn't agree or suggest a ransom. He went and got them by the sword. And he knew very well that there was a chance that some or many would die in the process. But the lesson was more important than the result. The lesson was, you kidnap our people, I'll come after you. Do your worst.
And destroy you.
And I will destroy you. Do your worst. You're not going to gain by this, except a quick death. I don't know if I told you this other story. When I relate this to people I speak to, they're incredible. I mean, they don't know what to say to me. During the fourth PMA, when we were releasing prisoners, John Kerry, Yemach Shemo, made an offer to Bibi in the cabinet at the time, that in exchange for releasing the worst terrorists imaginable, people whose hands weren't drenched in blood, but their entire body was drenched in blood.
Just to remind our viewers, what terrible deal or capitulation are we referring to now?
This was in the Obama administration, when John Kerry offered to release me in exchange for Israel making a gesture to the PA by releasing some of the worst terrorists imaginable. The deal with me was that I would not be permitted to return to Israel ever, but I would be freed in Galut. So he asked Esther, my wife at the time, Aleh Shalom, to come ask me for my response. Now, you can argue the ethics of having a person in my position with no hope at the time of being released. I was going to die in prison. That was my sentence. Make a decision on whether or not I would allow these horrible terrorists to go free. And they did, by the way, later. But I think Bibi understood very well what my answer was going to be. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. So Esther, alayhi salam, came to see me with the question. So she asked me, before you answer, I want you to know that if you say no and you stay in prison, I will stay with you. And if you say yes and you remain in the midbar, I will stay with you. So she said, what's your answer? So I said, no. So she said, well, can you give me a slightly more sophisticated answer than that? I have to go back to the cabinet and brief them. And I said, okay, hell no. So she smiles and she said, look, I need you to give me an intellectual answer that won't make me feel like a fool. So what is your answer? And I said, the answer is no for three reasons. Number one, if I agree to this, I will be devaluating the life of the victims. Number two, I will be lowering deterrence and encouraging additional acts of murder in our country by these animals. And thirdly, if I agree to this, I will be inflicting horrific pain on the victims' families who realized that the murders of their loved ones were being released because their fellow Jew was too weak to do the time that he was given. So I said, for those three reasons, I have to say no. So she looked at me. Now, Esther, alayhi salam, was my morah. And she said,
your teacher.
My teacher. She studied with Emmanuel Shochet, Rav Emmanuel Shochet in Montreal for many, 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 many years. Toronto, many, many years. And she said, that's a fine answer, but it's not the Jewish answer. She said, as a Jew, you have to keep three things always in mind. Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Al Pi Torat Yisrael. And she said, everything you do has to be evaluated by those three things. So that when you stand before the Kisei HaKavod, hopefully after 120 years, and he asks you, why did you betray my land? Why did you prefer the Midbar to Eretz HaKodesh? She said, you won't have to worry about that because you will not have done it. You will remember what happened the last time, actually the first time that occurred with the Meraglim, when they cursed the land in order to keep their covet in the Midbar. And she said, we've been paying for that ever since. So she said, there are only two ways you can come home. Either as a Met, to be buried in Knesset Yisrael, or as an old man, and you get down and you kiss the ground. This is what Jews do. We don't live for the present. We live for Shemayim. And I understand it's hard to ask of children to know this. But we know what happened during Hanukkah with children who were told, you either eat treif or you die. And they died. Al Kiddush Hashem. A whole family, in fact, died. And the Greeks were begging them, please, they didn't even want to do it. So when I look at this hostage situation, I have to see it through the lens of my own experience. The government didn't have any problem at all letting me rot to possibly to death. They didn't have any problem with that at all. And frankly, if that would have been my fate, well, at least I would have kept faith with a higher power and with my wife, a good woman. So now,
very special woman. I do want to have bring this current session to a conclusion. I think we can all agree that, as I said at the very beginning, I repeat now in conclusion, it is crystal clear that the Jewish nation is in dire need of a radically different ideology and a different leadership. And therefore, next time that we speak, with Hashem's help, perhaps we can address that question. How can we begin to take certain actions and create the infrastructure for producing the kind of leadership that the Jewish people so direly, so terribly needs and deserves.
To end on a high note, the Geula Shlema will come either with a shmais or with a kiss, depending on what we do. And that leads directly to the question we will address in our next conversation.
Once again, it's been a pleasure and an honor. And thank you for your many words of wisdom, my friend. Shalom.
Thank you. Shalom.